Night shifts at the museum were always the same, a routine I had followed for months, almost to the second. The buzz of the overhead lights hummed through the empty halls, broken only by the occasional sound of the heating system clicking on. The air always carried a faint smell of dust and aged wood, a scent I had grown accustomed to. I would start with the West Wing, a collection of artifacts too delicate to be touched by visitors during the day. Glass cases reflected my flashlight as I passed by, my footsteps softened by the polished marble floors. The Egyptian exhibit stood empty and unmoving, the ancient sarcophagi standing in their upright displays like forgotten sentinels. The Greco-Roman Hall was my favorite, lined with statues of gods and warriors, all frozen in time, locked in battle or contemplation. I often found myself staring at them longer than necessary, drawn in by the impossible realism of the sculpting. I had made it halfway through my rounds when something caught my eye. In the center of the hall, beneath a skylight that bathed it in moonlight, stood a life-sized marble statue of a woman. She was dressed in a flowing gown, one arm resting delicately against her waist while the other reached slightly outward. Her face was soft, almost peaceful, with closed eyes and the faintest trace of a smile. It was a familiar sight. I had walked past it every night. But something was wrong. The statue was angled differently, a subtle but unmistakable shift. It had always faced straight ahead, its expression cast downward as if lost in thought. Now, the head was slightly tilted, and the body seemed to have turned just a fraction toward the hallway. The change was so slight that I second-guessed myself. Maybe a crew had moved it earlier for cleaning. Still, the sight unsettled me. I moved closer, scanning the base for any signs that it had been recently disturbed. There were no scuff marks, no residue from sliding it across the floor. The plaque at its base, untitled, Marble Figure 1903, remained in its proper place. I leaned down, inspecting for any mechanical components. Maybe it was an interactive exhibit I had never paid attention to before. Nothing. Solid stone. Sighing, I placed both hands on the statue's shoulders and carefully repositioned it back to its usual stance. The stone was as cold as ice beneath my fingers. As I adjusted its posture, an odd sensation crept up my spine, a quiet, lingering discomfort like standing too close to someone in an otherwise empty room. Stepping back, I shook off the feeling and continued my rounds, heading toward the security office. The small, windowless room was crammed with monitors displaying live footage from cameras stationed throughout the museum. The grainy screens flickered, showing empty corridors, silent exhibits, and motionless artifacts. I rewound the footage from earlier, watching the statue in the background of the recordings. It had been still for hours, exactly where it was supposed to be. I fast-forwarded. Everything remained normal, until roughly 10 minutes before I arrived in the hall. The feed glitched for a split second, the image momentarily distorting. When it cleared, the statue had moved. It was no longer facing forward. Its head had turned ever so slightly toward the camera. My stomach tightened. I scrubbed the footage back again, watching frame by frame. The shift was slow, imperceptibly gradual, as if it had taken minutes rather than seconds. The grainy image made it difficult to be sure, but as I zoomed in, I swore the corners of its mouth had changed. The statue was smiling. Not the soft, neutral expression it had worn before. No, this was something else. The lips had stretched, just slightly, just enough to be noticeable. It was the kind of smile that didn't belong on something lifeless. I sat frozen, staring at the screen, feeling a creeping unease settle into my bones. There had to be an explanation. A camera malfunction. A trick of the lighting. Maybe I was just tired, my mind filling in the blanks where nothing had really changed. Still, when I turned back to the monitors, I found myself avoiding the feed from the Greco-Roman Hall. The following night, I stepped into the museum with a strange sense of apprehension. It wasn't the usual quiet unease that came with working alone in a building filled with motionless figures. This was heavier, more insidious. The kind of feeling that settled deep in the gut, whispering that something was wrong before the mind had proof. I tried to shake it off as I made my rounds. The West Wing was as still as ever, its artifacts arranged with meticulous precision. The Greco-Roman hall loomed ahead, bathed in the dim glow of overhead lights. My breath slowed as I stepped inside. The statue was missing. I stopped cold. The marble pedestal stood empty beneath the skylight, a pale square of dust marking where the figure had been. My first thought was that someone had moved it, perhaps for restoration or an exhibit change. But there had been no notices, no scheduled adjustments. And why would they take only that statue? A growing sense of dread pushed me forward. I scanned the hall, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. And then I saw it. The statue was no longer in the center of the room. It had been moved, repositioned against the far wall, standing just beside the arched exit leading to the next corridor. It was facing me. The serene expression was still there, but something about it made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the angle of the dim lighting, or the way the shadows stretched across its smooth features, but the smile seemed deeper, more deliberate. My chest tightened. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps a cleaning crew had adjusted it and forgotten to mention it. Maybe I had misremembered its placement from the night before. But that didn't explain the feeling. That creeping sensation of being watched. I forced myself to continue my rounds, but the thought gnawed at me, unsettled and persistent. As soon as I reached the security office, I locked the door behind me and pulled up the footage. The grainy screen showed an empty hall, just as I'd left it the night before. The hours passed in stillness. Then, sometime after I'd gone home, the footage flickered. A glitch. When the feed returned, the statue was no longer on its pedestal. I leaned in closer, heart pounding. The security log showed no unauthorized access, no motion detected. I scrubbed backward, watching frame by frame. The moment of the glitch was quick, just a split second of distortion, but when I paused at the exact frame, the statue's eyes were open, wide and staring, hollow and dark, looking directly into the camera. A shudder crawled up my spine. I let the footage play again. The glitch repeated, and when the screen cleared, the statue was gone from its original position. But now, at the edge of the frame, just barely visible in the dim light, a figure stood in the archway. It was too far to make out the details, but the posture, the shape, it was unmistakable. The statue had moved. Not just shifted, relocated. But that wasn't what made my stomach drop. In the final frame, just before the feed cut to the next timestamp, I could see myself. I was standing in front of the statue, just as I had the night before. But something was wrong with the way I was holding myself. The me in the footage wasn't just adjusting the figure. He was hesitating. His hands hovered over the marble shoulders, fingers curled as if resisting, as if touching it was the last thing he wanted to do. I didn't remember that. The memory in my mind was clear. I had approached, adjusted its position, and continued my rounds. Simple, routine, but the screen told a different story. The lights flickered. A small, nearly imperceptible tremor ran through the building. The hum of electricity cut out. The security monitors went black. The office plunged into darkness. My breath came fast and shallow. The emergency generator should have kicked in immediately, but the silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Somewhere beyond the office walls, in the vast emptiness of the museum, something shifted. Not the creak of settling wood, not the quiet scuttle of mice in the vents. A deliberate movement. Soft, slow, deliberate. My pulse thundered in my ears. The emergency lights flickered weakly, casting faint, wavering shadows against the walls. I reached blindly for my flashlight, gripping it so hard my fingers ached. Then the monitors flared back to life. And I wasn't alone. The statue was inside the office. It stood just inches from the desk, so close I could see the faint texture of its marble skin, the smoothness of its carved lips. And it was smiling, not the passive, delicate expression it had worn before. This was something else, something knowing, something hungry. I couldn't move. The air was thick and heavy, pressing against my chest like a weight. The back of my mind screamed at me to run, to turn away, to do anything, but keep looking. The lights flickered again. For the briefest moment, the room was thrown into pitch black. When the light returned, the statue was closer. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the chair. My breath hitched. ragged and uneven. The security footage continued to play on the monitor behind it, looping through the previous night's events, that distorted grin frozen in time. A quiet crackling filled the room, barely audible over the rush of blood in my ears. The security feed flickered again, distorting into static. The statue's head tilted. Its grin widened. The logical part of my brain was screaming for an explanation. A prank. A bizarre, well-executed prank. That was the only thing that made sense. I had to prove it. I had to prove to myself that there was nothing unnatural happening, that the mounting fear clawing at my stomach was just paranoia. With shaky fingers, I accessed the security logs. If someone had moved the statue, if someone was behind this, there had to be a record. The museum kept meticulous logs of shift assignments, door accesses, and staff movements. I scrolled through the recent entries, scanning for anything unusual. Then I saw it. 1 week ago, my name wasn't listed as the assigned night guard. Someone else had been scheduled, but there was no record of him leaving. The log showed his check-in at the start of the shift, but there was no corresponding checkout. No notes, no reports filed. It was as if he had simply stopped existing. My mouth went dry. I needed more. I had never met the other guard, never even knew there was someone assigned before me. I hurried to the employee lockers, hoping for some kind of explanation. The locker room was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs buzzing faintly overhead. Rows of metal doors lined the space, each labeled with a name. I found his locker near the back. It was untouched. His uniform was still hanging neatly inside. A half-drunk bottle of water sat on the shelf, condensation long-dried. A keyring rested beside it, along with a leather wallet that looked like it hadn't been touched in days. Who leaves their wallet behind? A sick realization settled in. He hadn't left. Not willingly. I turned and nearly jumped out of my skin. My own reflection stared back at me from the mirror mounted on the wall, but for half a second, I expected to see someone else. Someone who wasn't supposed to be here. I forced myself to move, retracing my steps back to the security office. The screens flickered with static before stabilizing, casting the museum in ghostly monochrome. I scrolled through last week's footage, heart hammering as I found the timestamp from the last recorded shift of the missing guard. The screen showed him walking through the Greco-Roman hall, flashlight scanning lazily over the statues. He stopped in front of the same statue that had moved. The statue was in its usual place then, standing still, head bowed, lips curved in that faint, unknowable smile. The guard tilted his head, staring at it for a long moment. Then, something changed. His stance shifted, his body going rigid. He wasn't moving, not even a flinch. His flashlight remained aimed at the marble figure, illuminating the smooth curves of its face. Seconds dragged by. He should have moved, should have turned, but he remained frozen. The camera feed flickered. When it resumed, he was gone. The flashlight lay abandoned on the floor, its beams stretching uselessly across the hall. The statue, however, was no longer in its original position. It was closer, facing the camera directly, and it was smiling. I stopped the footage, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in, the glow of the monitors casting unnatural shadows along the floor. This wasn't a prank. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed my supervisor. A dial tone droned in my ear. 1 ring. 2. A soft rustling sound filled the room. I froze, my grip tightening around the phone. The sound wasn't coming from the speakers. It was behind me. The call connected just as I turned to look. For a fraction of a second, my phone screen reflected something standing over my shoulder. Something that wasn't me. The moment my phone screen reflected the thing standing behind me, I spun around, heart hammering. There was nothing there. The office was empty, silent, except for the faint hum of the security monitors. The reflection must have been a trick of the light, some distortion from the screen, but no part of me truly believed that. The room felt wrong. The air was thick, pressing against my chest, weighing down my limbs. I had to get out. Pushing away from the desk, I hurried down the corridor toward the main entrance. The museum doors were fitted with security locks, but my key card should have granted me instant access. I swiped it once. The red light blinked. Denied. I tried again. The light remained red. A deep, crawling dread crept through my veins. I stepped back, my breath coming too fast, my mind grasping for a logical reason. The system had locked me in. A malfunction. A simple glitch. Then my radio crackled. A burst of static filled the empty hall, sharp and grating. The sound wavered, shifting into something that almost resembled breathing. A low, distorted whisper bled through the static, dragging out my name in a voice that was not my own. The radio fell from my hands, clattering against the marble floor. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. The whispering didn't stop. The static swelled, distorting into something jagged and pulsing, like a transmission from a place where voices didn't belong. I turned and my stomach dropped. The statue was standing in the middle of the corridor. It hadn't been there before. It should have been in the Greco-Roman hall where I last saw it. But now it was here, closer than ever. The same delicate features, the same flowing marble gown. But something had changed. The smile was wider. The lips, once a subtle curve, had stretched into something unnatural. The expression no longer held serenity. It held amusement. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. This thing was playing with me. The fire axe. Every hallway in the museum had emergency tools mounted in glass cases, including fire axes. A way out. A way to stop this. I forced my legs to move, stumbling backward, keeping my eyes locked on the statue as I edged toward the case on the wall. The red-handled axe gleamed behind the glass. My fingers fumbled for the latch, breaking it open with more force than necessary. I yanked the axe free, gripping the handle so tightly my knuckles ached. I wouldn't let this thing keep me here. Lifting the axe, I stepped forward, raising it high over my shoulder. I would shatter it, reduce it to dust. If it could move, if it could follow, then it wasn't just stone. It could be broken. The moment before I swung, the statue's head turned. It moved, right in front of me. A slow, deliberate tilt, as if acknowledging my decision. Its lips parted slightly, revealing a sliver of darkness between them. Something cold crawled up my spine. Then the lights flickered. Darkness swallowed the corridor for a fraction of a second. When the light returned, the statue was gone. My breath came in ragged gasps. My grip on the axe faltered. I scanned the hallway, the ceiling, the corners, my own reflection in the glass cases lining the walls. A shadow fell across the floor in front of me. I turned slowly. The statue was blocking the exit. It stood in front of the museum doors, its hands positioned slightly differently now, arms spread as if welcoming me, or trapping me. The axe slipped from my grasp, clattering against the floor. A sensation I couldn't explain began creeping through my limbs. A numbness seeping from my fingertips up my arms, coiling around my spine. My legs refused to move. My breath turned shallow. I tried to lift my hand, to step back, to do anything. Nothing happened. The weight of my limbs grew heavier. My skin felt cold. My joints stiffened. I tried to cry out, but my throat locked, trapping the sound inside me. I wasn't just frozen in fear. I was turning to stone. The museum opened as usual the next morning. Visitors streamed in, their voices echoing through the high ceilings, their footsteps tapping against the polished marble floors. Parents guided their children through the exhibits, pointing out ancient artifacts and classical sculptures with quiet admiration. School groups trailed behind guides who recited rehearsed facts about art history and preservation. No one noticed the new addition at first. It stood at the far end of the Greco-Roman hall, positioned just beyond the familiar statues of gods and warriors. A life-sized marble figure, remarkably detailed, its uniform sculpted with intricate folds, its security badge etched with an impossible precision. Even the individual strands of hair were captured with near photographic accuracy, frozen in a moment of alarm. The face was the most striking feature. The expression was not serene nor dignified like the others. It was one of horror, eyes wide, mouth slightly parted as if mid-scream, a look of fear carved into its rigid features. The plaque at its base was simple, blending in with the others. Untitled, Marble Figure 2023. Museum patrons admired the craftsmanship. Some commented on how lifelike it was, how the artist had managed to capture such raw emotion in stone. Others moved past it quickly, an inexplicable discomfort settling in their chests, as if they had seen something they weren't meant to. By nightfall, the last of the visitors had left, and the doors were locked once more. The museum returned to silence. The new night guard arrived for his shift, badge still crisp on his uniform. He was young, new to the job, adjusting the radio clip to his belt as he made his rounds. His footsteps echoed through the museum, the security office screens flickering softly behind him. When he entered the Greco-Roman hall, he paused. Something about the statue unsettled him. He had worked here for only a week, but he was sure this wasn't here before. The others were listed in the staff handbook, their history meticulously recorded. But this one had appeared overnight. The face bothered him the most. Most sculptures depicted gods, philosophers, warriors. This one depicted fear. For a moment, as he walked past, he could have sworn it was trying to move. The mouth, slightly open, seemed almost strained, like it was still trying to scream. A cold shiver crawled up his spine, but he shook it off. It was just a statue, after all, a piece of art, nothing more. He continued his patrol, heading toward the security office to check the monitors. Behind him, in the dim museum light, another statue subtly shifted its position. Its grin grew just a little wider.